Okay, well, I'm here to talk about Bitcoin today. So I'm sure you've all heard of it and you have some idea of what it is, but I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail and talk about some of the things that are good and bad about it, and also tell you a lot about how it works. So someone named Satoshi Nakamoto came up with the idea of Bitcoin. This wasn't completely original. There had been some previous work on what it would take to build a digital currency, but he or the group of people known by that name are the ones who really made it happen. So they wrote a Bitcoin paper that was released in January of '09, and that described pretty much the protocol that we have today. There have been some small changes to improve security and things like that, but the bulk of it is pretty much the way it was originally imagined. Nobody knows exactly who he is, if he is even one person. Um, People are interested for several reasons, one of which is that he owns 1 million Bitcoins because he got to create the first blocks. And so he has Bitcoins that this week are worth somewhere around $3 billion. He was active in the community from about January of '09 to mid-2010. And so he would answer questions and discuss the protocol and things like that. And then he disappeared and has not really been heard from since. There are a lot of theories about who he might be. There was a big stir sometime last year about him maybe being this guy named Craig Wright, but most people concluded in the end that Craig Wright wanted everyone to think that he was Satoshi, but that he wasn't. And currently the best guess seems to be someone named Nick Szabo, who apparently has the technical chops to have done this, but he has actually publicly denied that he is Satoshi, for whatever that's worth. So Bitcoin is a digital currency. So the idea is that it works like money. It's maintained by a peer-to-peer network that anybody can join. So if you go get the Bitcoin Core software, you can put it on your computer and start running it, and then your computer will be helping to process transactions in this currency. It uses something called the blockchain as a distributed ledger, and we'll talk in detail about that later, but the basic idea is that everyone has a copy of all the transactions that have happened. And so there's agreement across the whole network about who owns what Bitcoins. You can get some Bitcoins by buying them with dollars. A few days ago, the transfer or the conversion rate was 1 Bitcoin to $27.38. So they're fairly expensive. You can actually break Bitcoins down into very small pieces though. 1 Satoshi is the smallest unit of Bitcoins, and I believe that's 1/100 millionth of a Bitcoin. So the fact that 1 Bitcoin is worth so much isn't really a problem. You could sell something if someone is willing to pay you in Bitcoins, or you can mine Bitcoins. If you have some fairly beefy hardware, you can run mining software and it will actually produce Bitcoins out of thin air. Right now, the reward for mining a block and getting it accepted into the blockchain is 12.5 Bitcoins or something like $34,000. So that could be lucrative. Some of the good and bad things about Bitcoins. Freedom. Freedom is one of the chief features that made it interesting to people. No one is in control of Bitcoin. Everyone who's part of the peer-to-peer network has some measure of control, but for anything to really change in the network, a large percentage of the people involved need to agree. One other nice thing, you control transaction fees. So with a credit card or something like that, the bank sets the fees. With Bitcoins, you actually set the fee when you try to make a transaction. And the amount that you put in as a transaction fee may make your transaction go through more quickly or take more time to be completed. But as of right now, you can put a 0 transaction fee onto your transfer and it will still go through eventually. It may take a few days. Bitcoin is safer for merchants. If you accept credit cards as a merchant, you have to worry about chargebacks, and if you get too many chargebacks, then you can lose your merchant account. With Bitcoin, that is not a problem. Merchants can see that the transfer happened and they can basically set their level of risk by waiting for confirmations on the transaction. And they don't really have to worry about chargebacks or anything similar to that. It's also safer for purchasers. With Bitcoins, the fact that you made a transfer and you used a Bitcoin address doesn't expose any useful information to the merchant. If you use a credit card, the merchant could steal your credit card, or they might just add some charges that they didn't tell you about in advance and charge you more than you expected. Neither of those things can happen with Bitcoin. Bitcoin's also transparent, which is pretty nice. All of the source code for Bitcoin Core is out there in the open, and all of the transactions that happen are on the blockchain, and anyone can go look at those. Some downsides: acceptance. You can't go to your corner store and buy things with Bitcoin. Volatility. There have been a lot of changes in the value of Bitcoin compared to the dollar. And there's no authority to fall back on if you have some kind of problem. So if you accidentally sent too much money to someone, there's nothing you can do. If you try to buy something from someone on eBay and they don't send you the product, you don't have an authority to go to complain, right? With a credit card, you could cancel the charges or something, but with Bitcoin, you don't have that recourse. For something like buying products on eBay, there actually is a way to make that safer, and I'll talk about that later on. So if we're going to create a digital currency, what do we need? Well, we need a few things. So for this to work, we're going to need some kind of network of computers that's going to process transactions. And if it's not going to be a centralized currency, then we need that to be some kind of peer-to-peer network. That means we need some incentive for people to join the network and actually participate, give up their CPU cycles and essentially the electricity they're using to run the node in your network. We need an agreement on who owns the currency, right? So if I give you some Bitcoins, we need a way of establishing that those belong to you. With a digital currency, someone could just copy the files that represent the dollars or Bitcoins, right? It's not, this is the problem they always have in Hollywood movies. Somebody gets the secret files on a USB key, and then the rest of the movie they spend chasing this guy around who has this USB key with the precious data on it. That's not what would really happen, right? You would make a copy, you'd put it in your Dropbox, and you're done. It's on 3 different computers in the cloud. The same thing could happen with a currency if you're not careful, right? If you have a file that represents some amount of Bitcoin, then anybody who can copy that file now has those Bitcoins, or maybe did they just counterfeit your currency? You have to think about these things. We want to make sure that only the owner of the Bitcoins can spend them. We also need to worry about spam and denial of service attacks. So if somebody doesn't like our network of peers, then they might send traffic to them or send them lots of garbage transactions or try things like that that might degrade the performance of our network and make the currency unusable. We also need to prevent double spending. So if I have a certain amount of Bitcoins, I should not be able to spend them with one merchant and then maybe quickly spend them with some other merchant before the first expenditure becomes known to the network. So we have to worry about that as well. In Bitcoin, the incentives for participation are 2. Right now, the main incentive is that you get a reward for mining blocks. So the way that the blockchain grows is that nodes in the network accept transactions. Basically, when you put a transaction into the network, it gets passed around between all the peers. And then the peers are all working on trying to add a block to the blockchain. So they gather a group of transactions into a block. And then there's a puzzle that they need to solve to successfully add that block to the blockchain. And it's basically a race. Whoever solves the puzzle first gets to add the block with those transactions to the blockchain, and they get a reward of 12.5 Bitcoins. So right now, there's a big incentive to work on adding blocks. That reward is halved every 4 years. So it started out at 50 Bitcoins, and it's halved twice so far. It's down to 12.5 now. And because of that, eventually, there will be no more reward for mining blocks. A total of 21 million Bitcoins are eventually going to be produced. The other way that you can get rewarded for processing blocks is with transaction fees. So each transaction in a block has inputs and outputs. And the inputs are essentially Bitcoins that belong to someone that are being spent in this transaction. And then the outputs are the accounts that they are being sent to, or the addresses, really the Bitcoin addresses that we're sending the money to. So obviously the inputs have to be at least as big as the outputs for your transaction. You can't take 3 Bitcoins from one account and send 4 Bitcoins to another. But it is possible to make the inputs a little bit larger than the outputs. So there's actually a difference. And if there is a if there is a difference, then the miner who processes that transaction gets to keep the difference. So that's the transaction fee. Over time, as the reward for mining blocks decreases, transaction fees will become the main reason for running a node in the network. So that gives us incentives. What about agreement on who owns what? So the way that this is going to work is with something called the blockchain. Every full node in the network has a complete copy of the blockchain, and the blockchain contains all of the Bitcoin transactions that have ever happened. So if you walk the chain, then by the end of it, you will know how many Bitcoins belong to each address, right? So you'd have to process all those transactions. You see money moving from here to there, and then that same money moving from that account to some third account. You have to walk the chain and figure out where the money is at the current time. But you can do that. Right now, the blockchain data is around 100 gigabytes of data. So when you start running a Bitcoin node for the first time, it's going to say that it's downloading for quite a while. Each block in the blockchain contains 4 things. It has a proof of work to show that it solved the puzzle. It has a reference to the previous block, which makes it a chain. We have the Coinbase transaction, which is the first transaction in the block, and that's the one that creates Bitcoins out of thin air. So that would contain the 12.5 free Bitcoins you get for creating the block and the transaction fees. And then it would contain many normal transactions, which are moving Bitcoins from one address to another. If you go to blockchain.info, you can actually see what's going on with the blockchain right now. And you can dig into the details of any block that you like. So here's one from a few days ago. You can see this block contains 1,300 transactions. It's block 471,237, so there are almost 500,000 blocks in the chain now. We can see that the output total of Bitcoins was 6,200 or so. So that's a lot of money changing hands, but it's 1,300 separate transactions. And then there were 4.9 Bitcoins in transaction fees. And then a block reward of 12.5 Bitcoins down at the bottom there. If we dig into the transactions in this block, we can see here's the Coinbase transaction, no inputs on this one. This would be the address of the person who mined the block, and they got a reward of 12.5 Bitcoins plus 4.9 something in transaction fees. Here's another transaction. We're moving Bitcoins from this address to these 2 addresses. This one is receiving 2.36 Bitcoins. This one gets 2.81. You'll see most transactions look like this, and the reason is that they take an output that happened previously to some address, and they have to spend the entire amount. So if someone sent you $20 in Bitcoin, and then you wanted to send 5 to somebody else, you have to send that whole 20 somewhere. So you would send the 5 to the person you're buying something from, and then you would send the remainder to yourself. And so that's what this really is. The first transaction is probably a vendor, or the first output is probably the vendor they're buying something from, and then the second would be the change. It would be basically the leftover Bitcoins from that input. Okay, so that's how we know who owns the coins, right? We have this blockchain that everyone has, and it has a list of transactions showing coins moving from one address to another. But how are we going to keep someone from spending Bitcoins that belong to someone else? So one thing that maybe isn't completely obvious is that the coins are not stored on your computer. The coins are really stored in the blockchain. The blockchain is just a list of transactions, and it says so many coins belong to this address, essentially. So when you want to spend coins, what you do is create another transaction that moves the coins from your address to someone else's address. So we want to make sure that only the person who owns those coins can create that transaction. For that to work, we need to know just a little bit about public key crypto. So with public key cryptography, we can generate a key pair. We have a public key and a private key, and it's very important that we keep the private key private. We can use this for encryption, but in Bitcoin, we're not interested in that. We're actually interested in signing messages. So when you have a private key, you can sign a message with your private key in such a way that anyone who has your public key can look at the signature and confirm that you really signed this message. So only someone owning your private key would be able to sign that message with that signature. And that's what we're going to use in Bitcoin to make sure we can't spend other people's money. So here's a list of transactions. This first transaction is a transaction from owner 0 to owner 1. And we're not going to worry too much about that one, but the key is this transaction has an output that lists some amount of Bitcoins, and it has owner 1's public key in it. All right, so this transaction was saying, here's the signature from owner 0, here's the amount of money we're transferring, and here's the public key for owner 1. That's the person who now owns the Bitcoins. So now if owner one wants to spend those Bitcoins, he needs to create another transaction. And one of the things he has to do is sign that transaction using his private key. So basically what's going to happen here is he will create a transaction with his signature and whoever he's paying's public key. And then anyone looking at that transaction can confirm that it was created by owner one, because they can take the public key from the previous transaction and check it against the signature in the new transaction. And only someone owning the matching private key could create a valid signature there. So this is how we keep the Bitcoins in the right hands. And so this whole series of transactions will be a chain of these public keys and then signatures verifying that, that the owner of that public key wants to transfer the coins further. The other thing we need to do is prevent denial of service attacks and spamming. And the way we do that is by making it hard to create a block. I've said that there's a puzzle that you must solve when you want to create a valid block, and that puzzle involves a hash function. So what a cryptographic hash function will do is take any input data, and it will convert it to a random-looking digest, and it's always the same length. The digest is always the same size. So if we put Fox into this function, we get some hex number out the other side. We can put a whole sentence in, get a hex number. If we change one character in the input, the output changes dramatically, and we can't predict the way it's going to change. All right, so these are essentially random numbers that we're getting out. And the important thing, the important property here for Bitcoin is that if we had an output that we wanted to produce, we wouldn't be able to do that. You can't predict what input is going to give you some specific output. And that means that the only way to find a specific output is just to take many guesses. And there are a ridiculous number of possible outputs, so that's going to take a lot of work. So the way this is used in the Bitcoin network is that each block we produce that we want to add to the blockchain needs to have in it a nonce. And this is a number that we can set to anything we like. But when we take that whole block that has been produced and we run it through a hash function, it has to give us a number below a certain bound. So that number is called the difficulty. So we have to find a block that when we hash it, gives us an output that's smaller than the difficulty. And the smaller we make the difficulty, the harder that will be, because the hash values are essentially random numbers. So if the difficulty is close to the maximum value that a hash can have, it won't take too many tries to get below that. If it's much lower than that, then we'll have to try a lot of different values for the nonce before we find one that actually works. So by using this, we can prevent spamming and denial of service because it takes a lot of work to create a block, and it's actually pretty easy to verify whether one is valid. So it's much more expensive for the attacker to create blocks than it is for the other computers in the network to accept them. This also lets us control the rate that blocks are produced. So the target rate on the Bitcoin network is 1 block every 10 minutes. And so as more and more people start to run nodes in the network, that the difficulty value gets lowered. And that means that the rate of production will stay the same. So as there's more horsepower being thrown at this problem, we just make it harder and harder to find a valid block so that you still find a valid block about once every 10 minutes. And this also is a way of rewarding miners who supply the network with more computing power. So the problem looks something like this example with Hello World. This obviously isn't a real block, but if we wanted to take Hello World and then append a number to it, and we want to find a hash value that starts with 4 zeros, then we would append 0 and try it, and append 1 and try it, and you can see we're just getting random garbage out of this thing every time. And it turns out once we get to 4250, we finally find a hash value that starts with 4 zeros. So this is small enough to meet some difficulty requirement. You can see that over time, this is the last 6 months, the difficulty of producing a block has been steadily increasing. That's because more and more people are running mining hardware and they're adding more horsepower to it. And so every 2 weeks, the network readjusts the difficulty to, or maybe it's once, is it 2 weeks? I think it's 2 weeks. And they adjust that difficulty value to keep the rate of block production pretty steady. So back here in September, it looks like the whole network was producing about 1.5 million terahashes a second. So that's a lot of hashes, but it's gone up quite a bit since then. So as of the end of May, I think it was, maybe June sometime, we had about 5 million terahashes a second. So it's gone up by a factor of 3 or more. in the last 6 months. And that means the difficulty has been increased proportionally. Okay, the other problem that we needed to solve is that you shouldn't be able to double spend your Bitcoins. So you shouldn't be able to buy something with Bitcoins and then quickly buy something else with the same Bitcoins. So before we can talk about how to prevent that, we need to know how you would try to do that. Up till now, I've said the blockchain is just a chain of blocks, but it's not quite that simple. It's possible for two miners to produce a new valid block at about the same time. So two people somewhere in the world each arrive at a valid block and then start to propagate their new block through the network. So let's say that block 1 was the accepted head of the blockchain by everyone. And then blocks 2 and 4 were discovered at about the same time. And then they start to spread through the network. When a node receives a new block that adds on to block 1, they will accept it and they will treat it as the new head of the blockchain. So this will represent the current state of the world. Whatever transactions happen in this block are considered to have actually occurred, right? Those Bitcoins have been transferred from one place to another. When a node receives a second block that hangs off an existing block and is valid, it will accept that too, and it will create a fork in the chain. So the node we're looking at here got block 2 first and accepted it as the main chain, and then received block 4 and kept it on as a fork. The transactions in this block are not considered real. They haven't actually happened, but we do keep that block around. So what's going to happen after that is some part of the network will think block 2 is the head of the chain, and another part of the network will think block 4 is the head of the chain. And so the nodes that like block 2 are working on creating a new block that adds on to block 2, and the other ones are working on a new block that will add on to block 4. And it's possible that those two things happen at about the same time too. So maybe we receive block 3 and block 7 and block 8, which are all created at about the same time. So this blockchain winds up forking. The key to handling this problem is that whenever one chain becomes longer than the others, it becomes the accepted chain. So if we'd received block 1 and 2, and then we received blocks 4 and 7 next, 7 would then become the head of the blockchain. That means that the transactions in block 2 would be undone, and the transactions in block 4 and 7 would be applied. Later on, this bottom chain gets longer than block 7, and it becomes the main chain. So the transactions in blocks 4 and 7 are reversed, the transactions in blocks 2, 3, and 5 are applied, and this is now the state of the world. So you can see this could cause some flux in the ownership of Bitcoins and in what people believe is going on with ownership. But in practice, blocks are generated about once every 10 minutes, so they don't happen at the same time very often. And as soon as one chain gets significantly far ahead of another, the other one is effectively dead. So in this picture, we're out here to block 10 on the main branch. For anything else to become the real accepted branch, the small number of computers that are working on adding onto block 9 would have to find 3 successful blocks before the rest of the network finds 1, right? So we would need to get 3 more blocks added onto 9 here before anyone successfully adds a block onto 10. And so unless they're a real attacker where they're deliberately trying to create blocks on a branch, that's not going to happen. Even if they are an attacker, it's not very easy to make that happen. So the way that you could double spend coins is to issue a transaction that maybe you're sending someone some money, that gets accepted into a block, and the merchant sees the transaction and then says, okay, I've shipped you the video game that you were trying to buy. Then you would immediately try to produce blocks on a fork that would cause that first block to become invalid, right? So the transactions, maybe block 2 contains your first transaction, and then you try to produce block 4 and block 7 fast enough that this becomes the accepted chain, and the transaction in block 2 is effectively erased. And then you can spend those Bitcoins again, either in one of these blocks or in a future block. So that's the danger. It turns out to make this happen, though, you need to control a significant percentage of the total processing power of the Bitcoin network. So the likelihood of this attack succeeding is based on how much horsepower you control. Confirmations are the number of blocks that have been added after the block with your transaction. And so if the merchant is foolish and they ship you your goods as soon as there's 1 block containing your transaction in the blockchain, then there's a decent chance that they will lose their money if you're trying to spend those Bitcoins twice. But most merchants will require you to have a certain number of confirmations before they actually ship anything. And so they're waiting for a certain number of blocks to be added after your block. Every time a block is added after yours, it makes it less and less likely that those charges can be reversed. So if we want the probability to be less than 1 in 1,000 that something can be reversed, and we think our attacker controls 10% of the network, then we only need 5 blocks to be added after a certain transaction to be sure that it can't be reversed with that probability. There's less than a 1 in 1,000 chance that that can be reversed. If the attacker controls more of the network, then we need more blocks. So if they have 15%, you need 8 blocks after your transaction. If they control 45% of the network, you need a lot of blocks after your transaction before you're sure that they can't reverse it. Actually, if they go over 50% of the processing power in the network, there's no way to be sure, because they can produce blocks faster than the rest of the world combined. And that means that no matter how many blocks are after the transaction you care about, the attacker could just start back from the beginning and create a chain, and eventually their chain will catch up and pass the chain from the rest of the world, and then all of those transactions will be reversed. This is pretty unlikely. There have been some coalitions of miners, I think it was in China, who have gotten close to 50%, but they actually split up their groups to make sure that they didn't get close to that number. They want the Bitcoin network to remain viable, and they didn't want people to be worried about this problem. Okay, so that's how you create a digital currency. How's that working out? Well, people seem to like it. Here's the value of Bitcoin over the last year. We started out around $700 last June, and this week we got very close to $3,000. So the value is going up. People seem to be using them a lot and thinking they are worth quite a bit. A few other things about Bitcoin. How do we keep our wallet safe? Well, your wallet is basically your private keys. Remember, the actual money, the actual Bitcoin balances are kept in the blockchain, which is a public data structure that everyone has a copy of. The only thing really in your wallet is the private keys that you have created to perform your Bitcoin transfers. Every time you perform a transfer, you're going to generate a new address. So that means you're essentially generating a new public-private key pair, and then you're having Bitcoin sent to that address. So the wallet contains all of these private keys that you've ever created for all the transactions that you have participated in. To keep that wallet safe, you need to use encryption, but you better not lose your password, right? If you lose your password, the Bitcoins have evaporated. You can no longer prove that they belong to you. You need to make backups, because if your hard drive crashes, you will lose all of your Bitcoins. But those better be very well encrypted, because if you put them in your Dropbox or wherever you're storing your backups, you don't want anybody to be able to crack the encryption and spend all your Bitcoins. If you want to really be secure, what you should do is split your Bitcoins between multiple wallets. So just like you wouldn't walk around with $50,000 in your wallet on the street, you don't want to have $50,000 in one Bitcoin wallet that you keep on your network connected PC. So what you should really do is split your Bitcoins so you have a small amount in one wallet, and then maybe you take the rest and put it in a different wallet and move that wallet offline. Store it on a USB key or something, and keep it where it can't be stolen by a virus or, you know, some kind of a browser attack, evil website. If you really want to save a lot of Bitcoins, you should have an offline wallet. There are a couple of ways to do that and still be able to perform transactions. You can have offline transaction signing, where you produce a transaction on your internet-connected PC, and then you store the transaction on a USB key. You put it into your non-internet connected PC, and it uses the wallet to sign the transaction, and then you move it back to the internet PC and send it off to someone. And there actually are hardware wallets that will do this kind of thing for you, where you actually have the public and private keys stored in the hardware wallet, and there's no way to get them out of that wallet. Another thing you can do for security is use multi-signature transactions. These are transactions where you need to prove you own more than one key to spend the Bitcoins. So one thing you could do is have a wallet on your phone and a wallet on your PC, and then if both agree on a transaction, your Bitcoins can be spent. And so it's a lot harder for an attacker to get both of those wallets. And also, if you have a significant amount of money in Bitcoins, you should think about what happens when you die, right? How will those become part of your estate. Somebody needs to have a copy of your wallet or a way of getting it. There's a lot of talk about how Bitcoin is anonymous. Bitcoin is relatively anonymous. You've probably heard about a lot of this crypto malware that's been running around lately. WannaCry happened a couple of weeks ago. That was a very poorly engineered example. There's another one called CryptoLocker that's been around for a couple of years, I think, and it's been much more successful. The WannaCry developers screwed up a lot of things, even related to Bitcoin. But the CryptoLocker developers are estimated to have taken in something like $100 million from people paying to get their files decrypted. So they're doing much better. They actually have tutorials in their software that tells you how to go get a Bitcoin account and create a wallet and buy Bitcoins on an exchange so that you can send them your money. So are these transfers really anonymous? Well, all the transactions are public, right? We can look at the blockchain and we can see every single transaction that's ever happened. Now, if you are following good practices, you would be using a different address for each transaction. So that means you are using a different private key for each one. But they can be tied to your purchases, right? Eventually, you're sending money to someone for some reason, and whatever it is you're hoping to get from them tells them something about you. If you're ordering something, they know your shipping address. If you're, buying a subscription to a website, maybe they have your email address or some other information about you. Maybe not. If you're buying a subscription to a website, you're probably completely anonymous. The other thing they can do is try to group together purchases made by the same address or made close together with those same Bitcoins and try to figure out who you are by what you're buying. And another possibility is the neighboring nodes in the peer-to-peer network do know your IP, right? So they can see a transaction come from you, but they don't know if it's originally from your PC or if it's been passed to you by someone else and you're just propagating it through the network. So if they have enough nodes in the network, they may be able to track down where the transaction originated and figure out who you are that way. So there are some people that have been tracked down and exposed for spending Bitcoins on certain things. You could probably also increase your anonymity. So if you receive Bitcoins from someone for one transaction and then you turn around and immediately spend them on something else, those two things can help you get tracked down, right? You receive Bitcoins from someone and maybe they can figure out what that is. Maybe that's a business or somebody that was sending you money. And then you spend your Bitcoins on something and they know who that destination address was. Then they can start to collect that data about you. You could put a bunch of intermediate transactions in between there, and it would be pretty hard to tell if those transactions were a bunch of different people or if you had just done that to cover your tracks. So there probably are some things you can do to make it harder to track you. All right, a couple of cool technical things. So one thing I said was that you need to sign your transaction to prove you own the private key so that you're allowed to spend your Bitcoins. But it's actually a little more complicated than that. The way that usually works is that each output has a certain number of Bitcoins associated with it, and it has a script. So here's the standard script for just transferring Bitcoin from one place to another. And when you try to create a transaction spending those Bitcoins, you need to provide the beginning of that script. And so in this case, what you would include is your signature from the transaction and your public key. The block before yours, or the transaction before yours that you're trying to spend, would contain this script, which includes the hash of your public key. So normally what you do is you supply the signature and the public key. This script will hash your public key and compare it to this hash to make sure they're the same. And then when those are the same, it will then take the signature and check the signature on the transaction against that public key. All right, so that's essentially what happens. But there's no reason that your script has to only be this. There's a small scripting language included in the Bitcoin core, and it can do other things too. So you could do things like, well, basically, anytime this script returns a 1 at the end, the Bitcoins are allowed to be spent. So you could create a transaction where the public key script is just 1. And that would mean whoever noticed that first could spend those Bitcoins. There are scripts out there where the public key script is 0, and that means those Bitcoins can never be spent. But you can do some other fancier things too. There's actually a thing called a multi-signature transaction, which has a slightly different script. Basically, we supply it with multiple signatures. So this part left of here, this op0 is because of a bug in the code, and then we have 2 signatures. this is what would be supplied by someone wanting to spend the Bitcoins. Actually, the opt2 tells us there were 2 signatures. So these first 4 things would be in the spending transaction, and the rest of the script would be in the transaction that sent you the Bitcoins. And so what we can do here is say we have these 3 public keys, and we want maybe some fraction of those people to agree before these Bitcoins can be spent. So we can set it up so that there are 2 keys, and one of those 2 is needed to spend the money. And that would be good for a couple's petty cash account, right? You could spend the money, either one of those, the husband or the wife could spend the money, right? We could have, say, a savings account with large amounts of money where we need 2 of 2 keys to spend the money. So they both have to agree to spend the money in that account. 2 of 2 is also the way you would do the 2 wallets thing that I talked about earlier, where you have a wallet on your PC and a wallet on your phone. You could do a 2 of 3 signature transaction where we have a savings account for a kid and the parents want to be able to approve purchases. So you need 2 signatures to approve a purchase. That means the child has to get one parent to sign off on it. And the parents can't take the money away from the kid unless they both agree, right? If they both agree, then they can sign it with 2 signatures and take the money back. You can do the same kind of thing for a board of directors. If we have 3 directors, maybe you need 2 out of 3 to agree to spend money, or 3 of 5 or 5 of 9. You can do any variation that you like. And then another 2 of 3 one that's interesting is to do buyer and seller escrow. So if you want to buy something on eBay, you could send some Bitcoins. You could add a transaction to the blockchain. And then you would agree with the seller. You and the seller would add your keys to the transaction. And you would also have an escrow service add their key to the transaction. All right. So now if any 2 of those 3 parties agree, they can spend the Bitcoins. So normally the transaction sends the money from the buyer to the seller. And if the transaction goes well and the buyer gets their item and everybody's happy, then the buyer and the seller sign the transaction and allow the money to be sent to the seller. If there's a problem, though, then they can talk to the escrow service. And if the escrow service sides with the buyer, they can both sign the transaction to send the money back to the buyer. If the escrow service agrees with the seller, they would both sign the transaction to send the money on into the seller's account. There is one fairly large problem looming for the Bitcoin network, which is called the scaling issue. So there is a block size limit. You cannot make a block currently larger than 1 megabyte, and that limits the number of transactions that we can fit into a block. This was originally put in to prevent denial of service. If you could create lots of large blocks, that would take up disk space on all the nodes, and it would probably take more time to hash and slow down the network. And so blocks are currently limited to 1 megabyte. There's also a block rate limit. When we adjust the difficulty periodically, that keeps the rate of block production at around 1 block per 10 minutes. And so because of both of these things, that means there's a certain limit on the number of transactions that can be processed per second. And if you work out the math, it's somewhere between 3 and 7 transactions per second right now. Well, that's good, but it's not enough to do business like, say, Visa does, right? I think they have 10,000 transactions a second. So something has to change if Bitcoin wants to keep growing. So right now there are 10 million users on the network, and we're starting to run into this as a problem. The upshot of this is that delays are rising and transaction fees are rising. Whenever a miner is creating a block, they're going to have a bunch of available transactions that have not yet been put into a block. And they're obviously going to choose the ones with the largest transaction fees, right? They'll choose the set with the largest fees so that when they complete the block, they get the most money for it. If there are peak times where there are more transactions than the system can process, then some transactions are being left out of blocks, right? So they have to wait a longer time to be confirmed. And so right now, if you want your transactions to be processed quickly, you need to add a transaction fee of about $3 to the transaction. And that's only going to get worse as the use of Bitcoin gets higher and more people are trying to submit transactions. So you have a choice. You can either pay more for your transaction fee to get things done quickly, or you can wait out a longer delay. So at the current time, if you put no transaction fee on your transaction, it will take hours usually. Sometimes it'll take a couple of days to be accepted. There are 2 ways that the Bitcoin protocol can be changed. There are soft forks and hard forks. The soft fork is a compatible change. So we change the software in a way that the new version can coexist with the old version. But this block size issue is not something that can be fixed with a soft fork. It's going to mean that there has to be a hard fork. And that means that everybody in the network is going to have to agree on it, and they're going to try to all switch over at the same time. So that's a big logistical issue, and there's been a lot of debate about what the version should be and how the problem should be solved. So in 2015, there were two proposals. One was just to make the block size adjustable, one was to raise it to 8 megabytes. And it seemed like this problem was going to be solved then, but nobody could agree on what to do. And so the problem grew, and in 2016, there were some new ideas, and now things are sort of coming to a head. It looks like probably by a year from now, this problem is going to have to be solved. And so there are two current proposals. One is Bitcoin Unlimited, which says that there's no size limit, and the blocks basically are in competition with each other. The miners will just choose which blocks to mine. And the other one is called SegWit, which fixes a separate problem called transaction malleability, but will also raise the size limit on the blocks to 4 megabytes. So that will allow quite a few more transactions per block. So with that, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Here are some links that you can check out if you're interested. And that is it. Are there questions?
I was putting some stuff in chat, but I was noticing that the thing about the anonymity, everything you were saying, I was like, that's like cash. Like you exchange cash, and if you send it to somebody and then they send you something, they have your address, or you meet somewhere and you can sort of get tracked down, and like people around know where you are, like physically or on the network. So it's like,
right, it's almost exactly the same. Yeah,
I think that people either think, oh my god, this is like super anonymous and I can like do illegal things with it, or they're worried that someone else can do that, and like it's the same as cash. It's like the government was like, oh no, we need to regulate this because people could do bad things. Well, do you follow people around you put tracking devices on cash? I mean,
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I didn't see all these questions while I was talking.
They were mostly just
I will teach you to get fabulously rich. All you have to do is improve on hashing algorithms beyond the current state of the art, and you will be fabulously rich. So it's good incentive to work on some hashing custom circuitry, right?
Are these hashing algorithms, are they problems that can be solved better with quantum computers, or are they ones that they
are? They are actually.
So that'll screw everything up. I guess
it's not the hashing. It's not the hashing that quantum computers will help with, but the current public key crypto that they're using will be broken by quantum computers. So if you can produce a working quantum computer, you can spend everybody else's Bitcoin. So it doesn't really matter how fast you can hash.
It doesn't make you more money legitimately. It makes you other people's money.
Right, exactly. That's actually one thing I forgot to mention. There was a calculator online that I went and looked at, and it tells you, based on your horsepower, how many Bitcoins you can expect to earn by mining. And so I put in my PC, and it said that I could expect to earn, it said my electricity cost would be about 35 cents a day, and that I could expect to earn about 1/10 of a cent every day.
So, do it.
Excellent plan. Yeah. This has actually driven production of a ton of custom hardware for hashing. So there are these little USB sticks that you can get that'll plug into your computer, and they just compute hashes like crazy. And they're always coming out with new generations of them because, the horsepower needed is getting higher and higher. And so if you look around on eBay, you'll find the previous generation for sale and the new generation, people are trying to buy. So everybody keeps upgrading their hardware as fast as they can.
So does that upgrading their hardware as fast as they can connect with the graph that you showed us in the middle, which is basically saying people are putting more horsepower into this, so we're making the problems harder, so we need more horsepower.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So really what matters is not the absolute horsepower that's being thrown at it. It's what percentage of that you own, right? It's essentially a lottery ticket or a lottery where every CPU cycle is a ticket, or every hash you produce is a ticket. And so whoever produces the most hashes wins the most often.
But it's, you want to have a lot of horsepower to, like get the block done before other people, but you also want to get it done at an efficient electricity cost so you actually make money, right?
Right. Yeah, if you're not careful, you'll pay more for electricity than the
You can't just
Bitcoins are
like
worth, right?
buy every computer you can find, put them in a room and make it parallel. Like
Right.
you actually have to make good hardware.
That would be a terrible way to do it. Yes.
Unless you're stealing electricity.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the dedicated hashing hardware is pretty effective, I think. And so you can make good money with that. The way it's actually done in practice is that people join mining pools. And so you don't have to have your hardware win. You all pool your efforts, and if anybody in the pool wins, then they divvy it up according to how many hashes you're providing. So it sort of smooths out the yield.
So Elon Musk and Solar City with connected to hash table computing would be the perfect thing because you're not paying for electricity, you're just computing.
Yeah. I mean, if you have free power, that changes the whole thing, right? You can throw everything you've got at it. Yeah, I think you're right. If Satoshi sold his 3 billion Bitcoins, that would be a problem. That might depress the value of the Bitcoin.
What's the total value or the total number of coins?
I think that something like 78% of the total are out there now. So that's around 14 or 15 million.
And what was the count of coins that Satoshi?
So I think that means something like $45 billion in Bitcoins exist right now. So he owns like 1 out of 15 Bitcoins right now.
That's a lot.
That is a significant fraction. It is true, anyone can look at the code and find security holes, and that has actually happened in the past, which has made some people rich.
Back to Satoshi having a ton of Bitcoin for a second, it's actually surprising how recently people have actually conspired to screw around with markets for like silver or gold. Like if you corner the market on something, you can really mess with prices and you can make a huge amount of money. And there's regulations that try to stop this. But it's surprising how recently people do that. And it seems like this is like a new venue for people to try to pull these huge scams.
Yeah, it seems like it. I don't know that different countries are sort of struggling with this, right? The regulations on Bitcoin are not very clear right now. I think the US has made some kind of statement on it saying it is currency, but that sort of varies depending on where you are in the world. And it's sort of hard for them to enforce any rules about it anyway, except for taxing you. The taxing is not too hard. If you turn it into dollars, then they can track you down. What else was in here? Yeah, so is Bitcoin going to $1 million? It probably is eventually. It's a deflationary currency, right? There are going to be 21 million ever, and people will lose them over time because their hard drives will crash or they will lose their password to their encryption or whatever. And so the number in circulation is going to decrease over time. So if they continue to be worth something, they may eventually be worth $1 million. I have not done very much Bitcoining, and it makes me sad. I heard a podcast about Bitcoin a few years ago, and I decided to buy $1,000 worth of Bitcoin, and I forgot to do it. And Bitcoin was at $1 at the time, so that would have been a pretty sizable profit. Of course, I comfort myself. I had one of the guys I played bridge with at lunch did that. He got in on it early and ran a miner, and he made a bunch of Bitcoins. He got about 300 of them from mining, and he waited until they got to a decent value, he thought, and he sold them off. And so he got maybe $5,000 and paid for some college classes. And if he held on to them, he would have, $10 million or $1 million, I guess. Yeah, something like $1 million. It's always a trick of knowing when to sell.
The weird thing to me about this being a cryptocurrency is it seems like a currency because it's a thing that by itself is sort of meaningless and you exchange it to do commerce, but it's unlike most currencies, the value changes so quickly that it's more like speculating in stocks. Like the value's going up, let's buy it, let's sell it. Right. Like you're not really buying and selling anything of intrinsic value, and it changes. So it's like, do I really want to use this as a currency?
Yeah, you have. I mean, you sort of have the same problem with other currencies, right?
Well, it depends on the economy. Like there are
Yeah,
things, there's economies that are more stable currencies, or the currencies that are more stable than others. And
right.
then there's systems in countries that actively stabilize the currencies
Yeah, some of
so
them are
that they
tied
don't,
to a real thing, right? Like the gold standard that we had. You don't have that same fluctuation.
yeah.
But yeah, I think you have the same problem. With currencies in smaller countries, you have that same kind of fluctuation, and
This,
you can
yeah, I mean,
speculate
this,
and transfer money between currencies to try to make money on it.
and you can do
But
that. You can buy funds that are the currencies of small countries and stuff, and you can try to make money on
right,
other currencies. And then this is like one of those things where some people are doing this because they want to make money on it, and some people think it's like the wave of the future. And it's a weird intersection because you're like, I want to buy and sell things with it, but I also don't want to sell it because I think the value is going to go up.
right.
You can't really do both at the same time without losing money.
Yeah, it's kind of a tough problem. I think, I don't know, the last month or two, there's been quite a spike. It's probably mostly speculation. Um, so it'll be interesting to see what happens next. But I think the key thing, if this is going to be a real viable currency, is to have as many people as possible have some Bitcoins and be involved. The more people are involved and the more they get spread out, the less volatile it's going to be. So we'll see if that happens or not. There are some other cryptocurrencies that are up and coming that are pretty interesting too. There's some that are just basically a different currency, but there's one called Ethereum that I need to dig into some more that's actually not really intended to be used as a currency for buying things. It's actually a currency used to perform computations. And so the idea with Ethereum is that their blockchain is actually performing computations, and you are submitting coins to pay for those computations to happen. And so it's really designed around the idea of smart contracts and things like that, trying to automate these processes in a public way that's auditable and that nobody can mess with. So that's a pretty cool thing, but I don't know enough about that to say anything about it.
I used to do this currency where my computer cycles were spent solving problems all the time, to build up whatever. And it was called SETI at home, and I never generated any aliens. If I finished one whole block of calculations, I was supposed to get an alien.
That's too bad.
Never got it.
I did that too, but I didn't know I was supposed to get an alien.
Well, I assumed that was how it works. Like, comes out of my computer.
I did holding it home at one point, and I don't think I ever got a protein. So
Yeah,
That's too bad.
I mean, you can go to the store and get protein, but I haven't found any aliens.
All right, I guess that's it. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Good job.